The museums of Denver have been in the front line of these developments, so it is fitting that we are meeting here again 27 years later. Are we empowered? As you ponder that question, let me suggest that museum education has advanced largely by empowering others to engage in our institutions. What then is the role of an education department looking forward? What should we be doing? Should we give more attention to interpretation, building a more polyvocal institution? Should we relinquish some of our event coordination in favor of greater content creation? Should we oversee visitor services and so on? And what about our long-standing relationship to schools? I believe one of our vital tasks is to broaden awareness of the ways we contribute to the greater good. We have to make sure that our ability to articulate what we do as a profession is matched by an equal effort to explain ourselves in the wider public sphere.
The issue at hand for us to explore is the future of museum education, and we have about 13 hours or so to do that and to come to some sort of resolution on the opportunities and challenges facing our field. Of course, I say that in jest. There will probably not be a lot of resolution. Given the kind of daunting topic that is at hand, I think it's safe to say that we may not leave our time here together with a ton of answers per se. So I think our goal might be to leave with some more promising and powerful questions that reflect our new and deeper understandings that arise maybe over the next couple of days, but give us a sense of direction and momentum for the future. And we thought we'd kick off the convening by gathering your insights via what we're calling a silent conversation. So on many of the tables, you'll see a blank sheet of paper, and we're going to place a question on each of those tables. For the next 30 minutes, we're going to walk around to each table and respond to the initial prompt and/or respond to your colleagues' responses to the initial prompt. I will read off our 10 beautiful questions, and then we'll try it, see how it goes. So, question number 1, what is the most promising development in our field? Which will be at which table? That table over there. What is the most worrisome development in our field? What language or phrases are you using to explain the value of museum education? How is the role of education changing at your institution? Is education an outmoded term? Do education offerings across institutions feel redundant? Number 7, how much should we be following the lead of the public education sector? What challenges remain for museums as they adapt to a rapidly changing digital world? How can we encourage greater diversity in our ranks? And what is your most pressing leadership-related question? So these questions are on the tables with the piece of paper.
What I would really like is one volunteer from each table to come up here and help me move these around. So one person, that will make 13 of you. Come on up. We're going to look at these 12 topics, and you are going to select which topic you are most interested in, and you're going to regroup yourself around that topic. So again, the topics are audiences/audience recruitment, diversity of audience, defining education, schools, curator/content connection, silos, making the case for the value of museum education, educator identity, innovation, leadership, funding, resource allocation, and diversity of staff.
The main idea was, is your education department at the table when you talk about resource allocations? And also, are we at the table when we talk about, we'd say like, okay, we know what the 14 museum goals are, or the 4 main museum goals are. But if those goals are all education and programs, and then education and programs gets 4% of your entire museum budget, that's not right. So we really need to make sure that the budget matches the goals. And it's not a percent by percent, but making sure that that is stated and very clear. So again, having a seat at the table. We wanted to make sure that all the education folks had the skills to be able to create a budget and manage a budget. And sometimes people don't even know what their budget is. And I was like, oh my God, how do you do that? And then, and other people have complete control over their budget, but they still need to make certain amounts of revenue. So you still have to put X amount of staffing or resources into your summer camp program because that's where the money comes from. So basically, you're using these allocations for your museum goals and for the greater good and for everything that your museum wants to do, and making that case strategically and not just making it up. Thank you.
We talked about inventing or finding examples of encouraging collaboration, redefining spaces, collaborative interpretive spaces, work or project spaces, mixing up offices, or if you can't physically change things, online platforms and teams. And then we talked about the fact that lack of consensus on institutional goals and priorities, and when that lack of consensus is reflected in performance appraisals and employee expectations, both makes it work. Are you going to be evaluated based on your department's goals or institutional goals? And that we need staff capacity to be able to, for educators, to demonstrate that they're meeting institutional goals, which primarily we think of as being the capacity of evaluation and assessment.
Education in general has seen a shift from developing programs to developing audiences. And the idea that the education department and those doing our jobs are being called upon by marketing to help market, being called upon by development to help a progressive engagement, being called upon for membership. So we don't just develop programs anymore. We develop audience. And what does that look like, and what does that mean we need to bring to the table?
We talked about diversity of audiences, and bringing in diverse audiences. Our main takeaways were, first of all, this idea that we want diverse audiences because it makes good social justice sense for many reasons, but we can't just always couch it in terms of social justice. It also, as we see changing demographics in this country, it's also good business sense. And so we have to recognize that we may be without audiences in the future if we don't figure out how to diversify our audiences now. We also talked about integration. We can't expect diverse audiences to walk through the doors of our museums if our staff is not diverse, and our boards are not diverse, and our content is not diverse. And in terms of content, it can't always be like the cordoned off little special diversity section. It's got to be integrated into the main content. And so integration is key. And we even talked about the term of diversity. Is that the right terminology, or should we be talking about inclusion and integration? And then we also had some examples in terms of control. You've got a community advisory group. How much control do you turn over to them? And at what point do you as staff, allow, what level of discomfort do you have with some of the choices that maybe are being made? And how do you relinquish some of that control? And maybe that's not an either or, but a spectrum of control, I guess.
And so there were questions about how to navigate organizational culture that may or may not tangibly value educators and the education department or the education team as a key decision maker, as a part and a voice in strategic initiatives. Jesse used the phrase, education is sort of the goodwill story of the museum, but not necessarily involved in some of the key strategic decisions. And so we spent a lot of time talking about how within our institutions and within our organizational culture, how we make the case for what we do, how we tell that story through documentation, through evaluation and metrics, sort of providing some of the nuts and bolts for the value that we create. One of the other theories that was put forward was the notion that education frequently is very dialed in to the visitor experience and to guest priorities and oftentimes serves as a surrogate or an advocate for the guest experience, and that our institutions, despite what sometimes leadership may say, may or may not be truly invested and committed to making decisions that support audiences, as opposed to the institution as a content expert or purveyor of expertise. And one of the most interesting things that I feel like emerged from that conversation was this notion that for museum education to be valued, it needs to be relevant to our audiences, and specifically formal ed, but different, special, and extraordinary.
There was a strong consensus that actually, in many areas, education is much more embedded in museums, and it is being consulted much more across many different areas of work in the museum. And the advocacy of education has more influence, but it seems like conversely, our professional identity is being diluted, and why is that? So we discussed that for quite a while. We talked about, how do we make sure our expertise doesn't get lost, so we don't just become, events facilitators, or even just like creativity process facilitators for our colleagues, which chimes a bell with some people. So one thing is more advocacy about that there is rigor to what we do. One thing was that it seemed like the table was thinking that a lot of the role is being defined by other people. It's not being defined by us, and I think that that's very true if you look at the differences across institutions about, where education sits, how senior it gets, what the parameters are of the roles. They're all being defined by other people, and how can we be more proactive about that? And we don't advocate for that impact, because there's a whole thing, which you may or may not subscribe to, about, if an educator's done their work well, it's seamless, it's not visible. But we need to be really clear about how important and how visible that should be, and be clear not just to the people we work with, but also to funders.
We talked about curators and content interaction at this table, and we talked about a lot of things that also spread out into what's already been said, but some real strong takeaways. Of course, we touched on the traditional model of expertise, which all of us still deal with in certain aspects, where we're working more in a curatorial role, more providing for colleagues and development for colleagues, rather than thinking about broader engagement across our audiences and working on public engagement in particular. And then one of the takeaways, after we thought we hadn't really answered any questions, was thinking about how we have forums and opportunities for us to talk as museum educators, and oftentimes we don't have our curators present. And we talked about maybe developing some sort of program or institute where a curator and educator come together to that kind of discussion on a national level.
We talked about leadership. The Post-it notes seem to be about three things: leadership in the field, leadership in my museum, and me as a leader. Those really were all of our points. We talked about top-down, helping the people above us understand what we do, and why don't they already know? Right? Take a second and just laugh at that a little bit, because it's okay. We talked about the semantics of communication, and perhaps that's why they don't know. The barrier to understanding might just be the words we use. And we talked about managing versus leading. My favorite thing I heard was, if AAMD is meeting in Detroit this week, why are we meeting in Denver? And maybe for the next one of these, we should be where AAMD is, so that we are all together.
And then another discussion was the measurement of success with school tours. Is it really how many students you brought through the door, or how many of those lifelong learners do you truly make once they come to your institution? And then I'm going to end it on a question that was brought up at our table, which I thought was part of a larger discussion. What about just getting rid of field trips? What would happen? Would you say yes? Would you say no? So I think that's part of the larger discussion, because our resounding comment to that was no. So, but it's an interesting question to ponder.
Basically, we came up with three takeaways, though. Innovation requires an environment where experimentation and risk-taking is encouraged, and failure is a viable and accepted option. Innovation can be a trap, especially when it's perceived as the outcome and not the or part of the process. And then finally, if we build thoughtful, relevant programs and exhibits for communities that address our mission and our goals, does it need to be innovative?
We all talked about how do we talk less and do more. So turn this talk and this conversation into concrete action. So one thing we talked about in how to do that is, we went around the table and we talked about what is one thing that we can do when we get back to our institutions to make this work happen now. Some examples were finding internal champions at different levels in different departments so that this work is not just the work of education, it's also the work of curatorial, executive, etc. And also finding allies. So as the few people of color in my museum in a decision-making position, it is not just my job to raise this as an issue, it's everyone else's job, so finding those allies. We talked about, going out into our communities and being humble and open and starting conversations with them and building that network by asking each community member that you meet to refer another community member. So you start to build that network truly, and they also start to get to know you. The second thing we talked about was recruitment and retention. So a lot of discussion about that. Everything from how we write our job descriptions, the language we use to talk about the qualifications for different positions within the museum, the locations for where we post our job opportunities, and how we can leverage our community contacts to do that. Paid internships and having better salaries for full-time work. That's a huge topic. And what are specific strategies to increase the funds towards internships and positions? And also building a trajectory within your institution. And what I mean by that is both programming and staffing. So is there a way where you can build an employment trajectory within your institution? So you have entry-level staff who are then supported in their professional development to reach the next position in your institution and the next, and all the while building their capacity to either be allies and or to diversify the field by their very presence. The third thing was to challenge our assumptions about the communities that we work with and the pools that we draw applicants from. Talking about the deficit is not in marginalized communities, the deficit is in our institutions, and addressing the deficit internally.
We had the topic of trying to define education, and in classic sense, we veered off into a discussion of what we do and why we do, but not defining education. Then we sort of had a breakthrough moment where we started trying to actually write a statement. So we started putting some words around what we were thinking, and what we came up with is that in education, we research, design, and implement conditions and structures for people to create and play, explore, study, observe, think, contemplate, dialogue, experiment, have experiences with and without words, process, disseminate, and create new capacities.
The contradictions between the priorities that we have and the priorities that our stakeholders like boards and donors and funders and all of that have. So, we talked about having more direct contact with funders and boards. Some of us felt that there wasn't enough direct face-to-face contact with those funders, and others of us are working on our own research and grant applications, even with grant writers in the institution. We didn't talk a whole lot about funding ourselves and keeping our jobs sustainable. It was broached a little bit, like how we feel that we're working in the constant churn of desperation, trying to kind of keep aloft of these challenges in our personal lives as well, trying to, have our families and pay our bills and all that great stuff while, having these ambitious goals for our institutions. And then we started talking about this interesting issue of the bricks and mortar museum and how relevant is it in the 21st century, because there was talk about digitizing our collection to become more accessible, but is that really working? And we talked about adaptive change versus technical change. How do we adapt to this? How do we move the conversation forward? If we're being asked by stakeholders to go outside the museum into communities and bring our good work to the communities, and that takes focus away from our bricks and mortar environment, and we are serving our mission, where does that leave us? Do we need a building to accomplish some of these goals? So.